The story of the most powerful financial empire in medieval history didn't start in a bank, but with 9 ragged men in Jerusalem in 1119. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ. How poor, you ask? Just look at their first seal. 2 knights had to share a single horse because they couldn't afford a second one. Their original goal was incredibly humble, protecting pilgrims from highwaymen on their journey to the Holy Land. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and, well, more poverty. They lived on alms and were stationed in a corner of the old Temple of Solomon, the place that gave them their legendary name, the Knights Templar. But don't let that pauper look fool you. These were the most elite warriors the world had ever produced. They were trained to fight to their very last breath and were strictly forbidden from retreating unless the enemy outnumbered them by more than 3 to 1. This sheer bravery and iron discipline helped them become an irreplaceable special forces unit in the Crusades. The greatest turning point came in 1139, when Pope Innocent II issued the papal bull Omne Datum Optimum. This decree transformed the Templar Order into a superpower organization. They were exempt from all taxes, allowed to build their own churches, and most importantly, they were not subject to the laws of any king. The only person with the authority to command them was the Pope. In other words, the Templars officially became above the law, possessing the most powerful passport on the planet. With swords in hand and divine privilege, they were ready to turn those initial alms into a financial empire that would rock the foundations of all Europe. Imagine you are a 12th century noble wanting to go on a pilgrimage from London to Jerusalem. The thousands of miles ahead are crawling with bandits, and carrying a chest of gold is basically hanging a "Please rob me" sign over your head. Right at that moment, the Knights Templar step in and offer a solution we now call a financial revolution. They turned their network of castles and fortified strongholds, stretching from Europe to the Middle East, into the safest bank branches on Earth. There, the Templars invented what we now know as the letter of credit, the ancestor of the modern check and ATM card. The process was brilliantly simple. You go to a Templar headquarters in your hometown and deposit your gold into their vault. Instead of gold, you receive a piece of parchment encoded with secret symbols that only the knights could decipher. Now, you could stroll across the world empty-handed. When you arrived at any Templar fortress in Jerusalem or Paris, you simply presented that piece of paper and withdrew the equivalent amount of gold. But why did people trust them so much? First, their fortresses were impregnable. Second, and most importantly, was their reputation. Since the knights had sworn a vow of poverty to serve God, cheating was out of the question. This absolute trust turned the Templars into humanity's first international bank. They didn't just hold money, they began lending it, managing assets for widows, and even operating a maritime transport system to move money and goods across oceans. From warriors guarding the roads, they became the ones controlling the lifeblood of the global economy. They were the first to prove that, in finance, trust is more precious than solid gold. By the 13th century, the Templars were no longer a mere military organization. They had evolved into the world's first and most powerful multinational corporation. Their power lay not just in the blade of their swords, but in the ink of their ledgers. Look at their asset portfolio. The Templars owned thousands of estates, the strongest castles in Europe, shipyards, and even the entire island of Cyprus. They had their own fleet of ships to dominate the trade routes of the Mediterranean. But their real power lay in a position that made everyone tremble: the creditors to the crowns. In England, kings trusted the Templars so much they used the New Temple in London as a national treasury. In France, the Templars acted as a literal Ministry of Finance, managing all revenues and expenditures for the monarchy. When a king needed money to go to war, to pay a ransom for a captured prince, or even to throw a lavish wedding, they had only one address to knock on: the Knights Templar. The order had created a borderless financial network. A knight in Paris could order a massive transfer of funds to Jerusalem with just a letter, something that governments of that time would take months to achieve. They stood above all nations, paid no taxes, and had their own court system. However, there's an old saying, if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $1 million, that's the bank's problem. The Templars had become too rich and too powerful. They held the debt of almost every European king, especially King Philip IV of France. When kings realized their entire kingdoms were in the pockets of these white-mantled knights, admiration turned to envy, and gratitude turned into a brutal plot to erase the debt. By the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, found himself in a dire situation. He was the most powerful man in France, but also the Templars' biggest debtor. Pointless wars had left the royal treasury bone dry, and the only solution Philip could think of wasn't to pay back the debt, but to eliminate the creditor. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, one of the most brutal raids in history took place. Under Philip's secret orders, the military simultaneously stormed every Templar headquarters across France. Thousands of knights, from aging veterans to young recruits, were arrested while they slept. To justify this blatant asset seizure, Philip orchestrated a classic smear campaign. He accused the Templars of heinous crimes, worshipping idols, spitting on the cross, and other depravities. In dark dungeons, the proudest knights were brutally tortured until they confessed to crimes they never committed. This wasn't a quest for justice, it was a calculated, hostile takeover. By branding the Templars as enemies of God, Philip could not only wipe out his massive debts, but also legally seize all their castles, lands, and chests of gold. Pope Clement V, under heavy pressure and threats from Philip, was forced to dissolve the order in 1312. That Friday the 13th went down in history as a symbol of bad luck and betrayal. The Templars, once the special forces of God and the financial tycoons protecting Europe, suddenly became hunted outlaws. But Philip made one miscalculation. Though he seized the land, the real treasure and the core financial secrets of the order seemed to vanish into thin air just before his soldiers could lay hands on them. In 1314, the final chapter of the Templars was written in blood and fire on the Ile de Juif in Paris. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the order, was led to the pyre after 7 years of torture. But before the flames consumed his body, he left a curse that sent shivers through the French monarchy. Amidst the fire, Molay cried out, "Pope Clement, King Philip, I summon you to the judgment seat of God within a year!" With terrifying coincidence, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV died within a year of the curse. Their deaths didn't just end a dynasty, but opened a new chapter for conspiracy theories. People began whispering, could it be that the Templars never truly disappeared? Though Philip seized the land, he soon realized a bitter truth. The solid gold treasure and the secret ledgers of the order had evaporated. Records exist of 18 Templar ships that secretly fled the port of La Rochelle just before the night of the arrests, carrying away the very essence of this financial empire. The legacy of the Templars became the inspiration for a series of theories. From fleeing to Scotland to become the precursors of the Freemasons, to laying the foundations for today's secretive and neutral Swiss banking system. Some even believe they were the ones who took the Holy Grail, or the Ark of the Covenant, into hiding. The Templars taught humanity a brutal lesson. You can own all the gold and silver in the world, but if you also own the debt of those holding the swords, you are playing a life-or-death game. They are gone, but the concepts of international banking, checks, and credit they created still run the world 24/7. The Templars didn't just leave behind a lost treasure. They left a financial source code that we still use in every transaction today.